Hello again, everyone. Welcome back. So good to be with you on this last lecture for the semester in world religions. Next week, it's really just all about wrapping up our last few things, which is to do a review session for the final exam and then to take the final exam next Thursday. So we've come all the way to our last recorded lecture session. Let me just kind of set up the topic and the material that we're going to cover in this little installment right now. So as we've already covered the different major world religious traditions, we studied the history, culture, traditions, beliefs, doctrines, notable figures, sacred places, sacred times of the major world religions of the planet. So we've talked about in this order: Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Chinese religious traditions, and the Japanese religious traditions. And now we've moved into our last topic in the course, which is just to analyze different arguments that have been written over time that try to make an argument that God exists. And so we've all studied, several such arguments now. We had one meeting dedicated to the ontological argument, which talks about the general definition of God being the greatest conceivable being. And then the argument tries to utilize that definition as the leverage to establish that God exists. Because as the author Saint Anselm, claims, some things only exist in the mind, like just make-believe things, like unicorns and fairies. And then there are some things that exist in the mind and in reality, like the device that you're watching this on, or the moon, or any other number of things, the White House, things that are really real and they're not just in your head. Between those two things, though, he argues that it is greater to exist in both the mind and in reality, because that's just more existence than to only be in the mind. So if God is defined as the greatest conceivable being, the author argues that that means he must exist in both the mind and in reality, because that is greater than to only exist in the mind. And if God did not exist in both, then that would be equivalent to saying that the greatest being is not as great as you could possibly imagine, which seems to be a contradiction. So that's his format of argument. It's based on the definition of God as the greatest conceivable being, and then the secondary claim that between only existing in the mind versus existing in the mind and in reality, it's greater to exist in both. So a being defined as the greatest of all things you can imagine would have to exist in both to fit the definition. And then after that, there was the cosmological argument. The cosmological argument says that basically everything has to have a cause. The example the author starts with, Richard Taylor was the author we read. He begins with the case of a sphere that somebody finds randomly in the woods. And the whole point of that example is that if you did find something so strange and unusual like that, you'd probably stop and wonder how it got there or what caused it to exist. And this then just highlights the concept that whenever anything exists, whether it's typical or whether it's unusual like that, there has to be an origin for it. There has to be some cause that it depends on for its existence. So everything has to have a cause. That's the principle of sufficient reason. The next point is that there's two types of truths. There's contingent and necessary truths. Contingent truths depend on something else for the fact that they're true, and they might have been false in a different set of circumstances. Like just the fact that you're watching this right now, I guess that's true since you're watching it. But had you chosen a different activity for the moment, then you wouldn't have been watching it, so it depends on your choice. So it's something that's contingent. On the other hand, there are necessary truths, which are things that could not possibly be false. For example, mathematics and so on. 2 + 2 is 4, something that can't be false in any scenario. So contingent truths are things that have to have a cause, according to the principle of sufficient reason. And the author argues that this universe existing, which is true, is something that's contingently true. He says that the fact the universe exists is contingent. Why? Because all the things that are a part of the universe are contingent, and every object and event within the universe has a beginning and an end, and therefore he thinks the whole set of all things must be contingent too. So if it's contingent and there has to be a cause for it, the only question is what could be that cause. It seems illogical to say that the universe could cause itself, because a contingent thing cannot be the thing it depends on itself. It has to be brought about by something prior to it. Could it be caused by something that's contingent? No, because even if it was something other than the universe, as long as it's contingent, then it must not be the first cause, because a contingent thing depends on yet something other than itself or its existence. So the only possibility, because that would lead to an infinite regress, he says. If the universe was caused by something contingent, then that would have to have its own cause, and there would be a cause of the cause of the cause. and that would just go on to infinity with no stopping point where we could find the first cause. So the author argues that there must be a necessary being which causes the contingent universe to exist, the cosmos, in other words, and this necessary being that everything else depends on, but which is itself independent. All things are caused by it, but it is caused by nothing. That would be God, and that's the argument for the cosmological. Then, just I'm doing summary for the moment to kind of keep us on track, because we will talk about objections to all these arguments today. That's why I want to kind of refamiliarize us with the arguments just one time. Another argument that is presented to try and prove God exists is sometimes called the teleological argument, or some call it the argument from design. And we studied a version of it that was written by the British priest and philosopher William Paley back in the year 1800. So his example that begins the essay is: imagine a person walks through the woods and they find a watch on the forest floor, like a wristwatch like this. If you found a watch, you would know right away that that thing had to come from an intelligent creator. Why? Because it's just too complicated and it's too specific in its function to just come about through random processes that have no architect or intelligent being crafting it. So like a watch could not just fall out of the sky or somehow bubble up out of the ground by a random sequence of events. It would have to be brought into being by an intelligent creature that had the full intent to make a watch for the purpose of telling time. So the principle he takes away from the whole watch example is that if something exists and it's complicated and it's got function within it, like say a watch, then that has to have an intelligent creator. And he thinks that's something that most anybody could agree with. He says, you would know that the watch had an intelligent creator, even if you saw that the watch was broken, even if you had never seen one being pieced together yourself, even if you don't know how it works. None of these things would lead you to have any moment of doubt that the watch definitely has a maker that is intelligent. So that's the only way a watch could come into being. The only way one could be generated is through some kind of intentional process by an intelligent life form. So then he uses that as his analogy. He says that in the universe, there are things that we see that have function and complexity, but they're not made by any kind of human being. We're talking about, like, say, the things that we find in nature, like the eye or the ears or the nose. These things perform tasks like sight or vision or smelling, and they can only do that according to a very complex configuration of biological components. So the author's argument is a watch, we know, cannot happen without a watchmaker. And so he says, so something just as complicated and functional, or even more so, like an eye, could also not have come about unless there was an intelligent maker that designed it for the purpose of vision. So the watch stands to the watchmaker as the things in nature with function and complexity stand to the creator of nature, which his claim is that's God. So God serves as the explanation in that argument for the existence of natural things which are significantly functional, purposive, or complex. And then there was Pascal's wager. That was our last lecture topic. Blaise Pascal, French philosopher of the 1600s, and his position was a slightly different angle. He said, well, I'm not even going to try to prove God exists, not at least directly, because he says that's not even possible to do. Nobody could prove whether God exists or not. Because if he does, Pascal says that he must be far beyond the ability of a human mind to fully conceive of. So he thinks, even if God exists, he's far outside of our level of comprehension. So that means we could never prove it or disprove it. It's just something that we'll have to basically take a choice on without proof. So he says it's kind of like a wager, isn't it? It's a wager which you could compare to a coin flip. If you flip a coin, like heads or tails coin, you know that it's going to be one of those two sides that lands, but you don't know which one. In the same way, he says, even if we can't prove whether God exists or doesn't exist, we know that it's got to be one of those two options, like either he does or he doesn't. So that much is certain. And knowing that one of the two things must be true, he says we're kind of like we're kind of like in the position of the coin flip bettor, the person who's betting on the coin flip. We know that one of the two sides will come down, either it's heads or tails, but we just don't know which one. And we're going to have to be forced to choose, he says. He calls this a forced wager, a wager that you can't avoid making a bet on. Because if you chose to take no position as to whether there's God or not, then if God exists, he would still treat you as though you don't believe in him, and therefore you'd still receive whatever punishments, or at least not receive whatever rewards that come from being an actual believer. So he says, basically, you're locked in. You have to choose one side or the other. Will you believe or will you not believe? There's no way to take a neutral position, because if you take no stance, then basically you're not believing. So what will it be then? Would it be belief or non-belief in God? He says you should weigh the stakes and the possible consequences of either bet. So suppose that you wager that God exists. If you're right and there is a God, then you're going to be rewarded to the infinite extent by going to heaven and having an infinitely happy afterlife for eternity. So that would be a great outcome. On the other hand, say you believed in God, but you were wrong and there actually isn't a God. If that's so, then I guess you don't get the rewards of heaven, but also there's nothing that you really lose either. So you could say that if you bet or wager that there's God, you could win a lot, and even if you lose, you're not losing much, if anything. On the other hand, if you choose to wager on the other side, you bet there's no God, that's your choice, then again, we have two possible results. Say you didn't believe in God, but actually there was a God. Therefore, you would have been wrong. And in that case, he says that's really a bad result because either you're going to be going to hell, which is obviously the worst thing you could imagine, infinite torture and torment for eternity, or maybe you just won't be allowed to proceed into heaven. In that case, you're still losing out on something infinitely good, the infinitely happy afterlife that goes on forever. On the other hand, say a person didn't believe in God and they were actually right, and there isn't a God after all. So we can say that they were correct, but have they gained anything? Has there been anything that they've benefited from on this? Maybe they've saved some time not having had practiced religion or etc. But it's a minor loss, if anything. It's a finite loss compared against it's a finite gain. I meant to say it's a finite gain compared against an infinite loss to those that don't believe. And to those that believe, it's either an infinite gain or a finite loss. So he says, if these are the two choices you have, it's a simple matter to just wager in favor that God exists. Just choose to believe. Because if you do, if you win everything. And if you lose, you really don't lose anything. On the other hand, if you wager there's no God, then if you lose everything. And if you win, you really don't win much. So he says one bet out of the two, two possible options poses the risks of great loss against the potential of very small gain. That's if you don't believe. On the other hand, if you chose to believe, then it's the opposite outcome, or combination of possible outcomes. If you choose to believe, there's much to be gained and not much is really being risked. So he thinks, if you're just going to be risk averse and rational, you should take the bet that poses less risks and higher rewards, when the other bet, the alternative, is exactly the opposite of that. It poses the risk of great loss against no significant gain. So basically, just believe and you'll be safer that way. Even if you're wrong, who cares? But if you're right, you could win a lot. If you don't believe, putting a lot at stake, and there's not much to benefit from, even if you happen to be correct on that side of the bet. Okay, so now we're down to the last author, and we're speaking now about this guy whose name is Ernest Nagel. Okay, I have a little portable whiteboard here. This is one of my offices. So here's the man's name, Ernest Nagel, and he lived from 1901 until 1985. So you see information here just about our author, Ernest Nagel, E-R-N-E-S-T, Ernest, N-A-G-E-L, Nagel. He lived from 1901 to 1985. He's considered one of the important 20th century philosophers. He was originally born in Czechoslovakia, and then he moved to America as a young man, and he taught for most of his life, and he also got his PhD at Columbia University in New York. This is a paper of his from 1959, and it's just called "Does God Exist?" ? Does God exist? So that's the title. It's a question. Does God exist? From Ernest Nagel, 1959. And just about Nagel, he's an atheist, so that just means he doesn't believe in God, and that means he has not been convinced by any of the arguments that we've studied that there is a God. He hasn't been convinced by these arguments. But we want to know exactly what it is that he finds so faulty in the arguments. So we're going to sort of take you now on a little tour of objections to these different arguments that we've all heard: the cosmological, the ontological, and the design argument. And then I'm just going to tell you a few brief points of info about how a person could also find fault with the Pascal's wager. So we're going to just have a whole survey of critical objections to these different arguments that God exists, because we want to have balance. We've heard the arguments that try to persuade that God is real, but we also want to hear why some don't find these arguments to be very solid or convincing. And then it's up to you to just sort of decide on your own. Did you think that there were better arguments for the case of God's existence, or did you think that the objections, showed that these arguments didn't have as much strength as they thought they did? So to start off, let me talk to you about Nagel's problems with the cosmological argument. Okay, so this is, I'm putting in our little chat, typed out chat. Okay, problems with the cosmological argument. So this is the first one that he takes aim at. He wants to try and show us what he didn't find good about this argument, the cosmological. And that, again, is the one that says everything has a cause, and therefore the universe must have a cause, which could only be God, because God is a necessary being, and that would be the only thing that could prevent there being infinite regress of causes. So what could be the problem? First thing he does is he summarizes the argument in a way that I think is nice and clear, even though it's very brief. It kind of captures the essence of the argument. So it says here on page of what I sent out to you, page 34 actually, but I don't know if that's displayed on the PDF. But anyway, it's the first page of the writing that you were given. And it says here, Nagel, one of the oldest intellectual defenses of theism is the cosmological argument, also known as the argument from first cause. Briefly put, the argument runs as follows. So now he summarizes it. He says, every event must have a cause. Hence, an event A must have as cause some event B. So suppose this is A, an event, and if it must have as cause some event B. So here's B, like this arrow is an arrow of causation going from the cause to the effect. So an event A must have as cause some event B, which in turn must have as cause some event C, and so on. But if there is no end to this backward sequence of causes, if it just goes dot, 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 on and on to infinity, this is the infinity symbol, then the sequence of causes would be infinite. And in the opinion of those that make the argument, an infinite sequence of events is impossible and absurd. Therefore, there must be a first cause. And the first cause is God, the initiator of all the change in the universe. So, like how, for example, say this is you, the fact that you exist, you're caused by your parents' existence. And your parents' existence is caused by their parents' existence. And it could just go back and back and back. But if we're talking about logic here, it doesn't seem possible for there to be an infinity of causes that goes back forever and never reaches to the beginnings of things. So wherever the buck stops of this backwards sequence of causes, there's got to be a first one. That's the argument's position. And wherever we get to the first cause, that will be the thing that everything else depends on, which itself is the source of all the other stuff. And that thing is the necessary being, that's God. So now we've heard him summarize the argument. But what is wrong with this argument? Okay, so he has a couple of problems that he raises. What are the different problems? So here's one of them. One problem is, if everything has to have a cause, because the argument says that everything has to have a cause, that's how it gets started, the universe has to have a cause, so that tries to push us in the direction of saying God's the cause of it. But here's the question of Nagel, our author today. If everything has to have a cause, then why doesn't God have to have a cause? Okay, you would think that that's a bit of an inconsistency. The argument is saying these two things at the same time. Number one, everything has a cause, but then they also say, but not God though. Everything has a cause except for God. But you could argue that that's a little bit inconsistent, because on the one hand, they're telling us to believe that everything has to have a cause, but then they deny it right afterwards when it comes to God, because he's supposed to be uncaused. And that might seem to be already a problem, because if everything has to have a cause, you'd think that God would have to have one too. So how can an argument tell us these two inconsistent things? Everything has a cause, but then there's God, and God does not have a cause. That's one problem with the argument. And he says that. He says, it's surely inconsistent to assume a first cause as a way of escaping from the coils of an infinite series. Because if everything must have a cause, why doesn't God require one for his own existence? Okay, so then he continues. He says, many people will say that the reason that God does not have to have a cause is because he's self-caused, or he's a necessary being with no cause at all. But now we have another problem, because if God could be an uncaused being, if God can have no cause, then why not just assume that this other thing has no cause? And then we wouldn't need to make an argument that there's something that created it. And I'm talking about just the cosmos or the universe itself. So if there can be something with no cause, like they're saying that God is in the argument. Then why can't the universe have no cause? Okay, so we have another problem here, and they're kind of connected. The first one says, how can you say that God doesn't have a cause when part of the argument is claiming that everything has one? How could it be that everything has to have a cause except God? On the other hand, if you create an exception for God and say, well, he's uncaused and he's necessary, that's why he has no cause, why couldn't we merely then just assume that it is the universe itself which is the uncaused necessary being? And if that was true, then we wouldn't need to make any kind of argument that establishes what the cause of the universe is. We would just say the universe is ultimate and it exists with no prior causal predicate behind it. Okay, so 2 points. The argument says everything has to have a cause, and that's why the universe has to be caused by something like God. But then it also denies that God has a cause. So what one issue is, why are you saying everything has a cause but not God? On the other hand, if you say that God might have no cause, why couldn't we then simply assume that it's the universe that has that characteristic of having no cause? After all, we know the universe exists, but the existence of God is a matter of debate and speculation. So if there's an uncaused necessary being, you'd think that saying it's the universe is at least a little bit more certain, because the universe is something that we know is real, whereas God is something external to it that we're postulating. If it's the universe itself, which is the uncaused, self-sufficient, necessary being, then we would not have to postulate some kind of mysterious relation between the universe and some external thing that brings it into being. And here we have another problem then. Is an infinite regress really even impossible? Maybe it is not impossible. So okay, the next problem with the argument is this point that I've just typed, which says, why is an infinite regress so impossible? Keep in mind that the proponent of the cosmological argument, the advocate, the follower of that argument, they would say that it cannot be that there's an infinite sequence of causes that regresses to infinity. That's just absurd. That's impossible. So there must be a first cause that initiates the whole sequence. But somebody might resist that argument. They might say, I don't know, why is it so impossible that there's an infinity of events that goes back with no origin? Maybe an infinite regress is actually not so impossible. And if it's not impossible, then there's no need to assume a first cause of the causal series. To say that it's not impossible for there to be an infinity of causes is to try and assert that there is a possibility for an infinite sequence of things. And we do have an idea of actual infinity in other fields of study, like mathematics or geometry or even set theory. As an example, let me ask you this. Say that we have the numbers 0 and 1. Is there a value that is in between the two numerically? And of course, the answer is yes, it's 0.5. Next question. Is there a numeric value that is right in the middle between 0 and 0.5? And we have another correct answer, which is that it's 0.25. Is there a numeric value that's in between 0 and 0.25? Yeah, it's 0.125. You get the point now? If I keep asking this question over and over again with the result obtained from the last iteration of this question, will I ever be able to exhaust the series of numeric values even between 0 and 1? No, there's going to be an actually infinite number of them because you can always generate another halfway value by expanding the decimal position out and dividing the thing by 2. So that means that there are just as many numbers in the real number series between 0 and 1 as there are in the entire natural number series of whole numbers going to infinity. So that's one way to conceptualize of actual infinity thought about mathematically, how the number line is infinitely dense and there's no way to exhaust all the points that lie on that line. Another example could be from geometry. Say that I have a line segment. Okay, a little quick refresher on studies in geometry just for a half second. So suppose that I have this line segment which starts with point A and ends with point B. That's the line segment AB. Now, is there a midpoint in between them? Yes. Let's label that and call it M. Now I ask you, is there a midpoint that lies in between A and M? And yes, that's the point that bisects this line segment, and let's call that M prime. Is there a midpoint in between the point A and M prime? Yes, this one, M double prime. And again, how many times could I reiterate the question, asking for another midpoint, and receive another unique position on the line? And again, it can go on to infinity because the geometric line has also got infinite linear density, and the points that compose it are considered to have no spatial extension. So we can never run out of points, basically, even between the two smallest intervals of space on a line. So the fact that there's an infinity of positions, even between two very small points on a finite length line, is another way of conceiving of infinity in that context. So Nagel says, it doesn't strike him as absolutely impossible for there to be an actual infinity of causes that go back with no beginning, because maybe the timeline of causation has infinite density, just like the number line or the geometric line. Okay, so now we've hit three different types of objection to the cosmological argument, and I'll just summarize them yet one more time. Cosmological argument said that everything existing has a cause, and the universe which exists must also have a cause, and the first cause of all these things must be something that is not caused by anything before it. That means that there is a necessary being that initiates the sequence of all other things. And if there was not a necessary being, the causal series would go on to infinity, and there would never be a beginning, and that many people say is absurd. But now we have problems with the argument according to the author Nagel. His first issue is, how can one say that everything has a cause, but at the same time deny that God has a cause? On the other hand, if somebody says that there's a being like God which is necessary and uncaused, then how come the universe couldn't simply be assumed to be that necessary being? And on the other hand, the argument of cosmological says that there cannot be an infinite regress of causes. There must be a first member in the sequence. But the author Nagel says, I don't know why that's so obvious. It's not to him clear that there could not be an infinite regress of causes, because we can think of actual infinite series in the contexts that I've mentioned here, either geometry or math. So we then move on to his next criticism of another major argument we've studied, problems with the ontological argument. Okay, what could be problematic or wrong or, I don't know, erroneous about that other type of argument? So, first of all, the argument says that God, if he really is as he is defined to be, he's defined as the greatest conceivable being. And according to the argument, part of that greatestness is to exist in reality and not just in the mind. But the way that argument is constructed is that it's saying that existing is an attribute that makes a being greater than if it didn't have that attribute. So existence is treated like it's a feature or a quality of something, a characteristic, like as though I told you that my hair is brown. Then brown would be the attribute of the hair. And so Anselm's argument assumes that God existing is a quality that he can't miss, because it's part of what makes something great. So one area of objection is to try and attack that claim that existence is an attribute that a perfect being would have to have. You could make the argument that existence is not really an attribute at all. So he says that that's the next criticism of the ontological argument. Existence is not an attribute. Okay. Now, there's many ways to try and explain this point that existence is not a quality of something, not a feature of something. An attribute is something you use to describe something. Like if I say that my dog is old, or if I say the dog is black in color, or if I say that the dog is a terrier, now I'm giving attributes that describe the dog. If I say it's big or if it's small, okay? Or if I talk about a car, I could say that the car is red or that the car has a sunroof. And these would be descriptions of the car, attributes ascribed to it. But one thing that you would never mention in giving a description of something is to point out that it exists. So imagine that you're trying to sell a car and you create an ad for it to generate interest in someone buying it. And the advertisement says, okay, this is a great car. Here, let me tell you what it's like. It's 4 doors. It's got a V6 engine. It's got power locks. It exists. Also, it has a nice AC unit. Now, notice right there that one of those things is not like the others. When I say that it exists, it just sort of sticks out like a sore thumb because it seems like I'm no longer in the business of describing the thing with attributes, but just pointing out a separate point, which is that it's even real. So logically, it doesn't really strike most people to think that existence is an attribute. And if it's not, then it doesn't serve the purposes of Anselm's ontological argument the way that he had hoped. Because his argument goes in this order. It says, God is defined as the greatest conceivable being. And in order to be that type of thing, it must have the quality of existing. But now Nagel comes through and says, actually, that's all wrong because existence, it's wrong for you to say that it's an attribute. It's just not logically an attribute. Now, he gives a slightly different example than the one I just mentioned to point out that it's not an attribute or to try and make that case. He gives this case of like, say, okay, $100 bill, in our currency, like with Benjamin Franklin's face, the blue face bills, the biggest banknote that you can have of currency. Now, I don't know if you or anyone watching this has a $100 bill in their wallet, but whether you do or don't, wouldn't you agree that that doesn't change the definition of that unit of currency and what it is? So if you have one in your wallet or if you don't, the definition remains the same. That's his way of pointing out that it's a different question whether something exists as opposed to what its definition is. Existence doesn't relate to the way we describe the thing. Another example of along similar lines. Dinosaurs, they used to exist. Today, they don't. Suppose that like Jurassic Park, some geneticist comes up with a way of engineering them to come back. So then they would be brought back from extinction. Throughout this entire time process of the dinosaurs first existing, then not existing, then existing again, wouldn't you agree that the definition of what that life form is not changing over time? The only thing that's changing with respect to that is whether the thing exists or doesn't exist. But that is irrelevant to the way it's described, the type of being that it is. So in either of these different ways, Nagel tries to make the point that it's logically wrong and confused for somebody to say that existence is an attribute. And if existence is not an attribute, then Anselm's argument just doesn't work because it's saying that a being who is perfect by definition would have the feature, the attribute of existing. There are other authors in history that have also criticized the ontological argument. Another one, just to mention on the side, is a man named Gaunilo. Just to tell you his name here, I'll put it in the chat. Gaunilo was a French monk who lived at around the same time Anselm did, and so he was aware of Anselm's book and his argument. And even though he himself was a Christian monk, so a big believer in God, he didn't think that this was the greatest argument to prove that God exists. So he didn't agree with the argument, even though he agrees with its conclusion. And his example is also, I think, helpful. He says, okay, imagine, if you will, an island, and I'm going to call it the Lost Island. Suppose that the Lost Island is defined as the greatest conceivable island. So whatever makes an island great, this island has it to the maximum degree. Perfect weather, perfect beaches, perfect, amenities or whatever else. So you're imagining in your mind right now the greatest conceivable island. Now, according to Anselm's argument, if this island is defined as the greatest conceivable island, that would mean that it also has to be real, that it has to actually exist. Because if it didn't, then it would be missing an attribute that qualifies it as great, so it wouldn't be the greatest conceivable island. So have I just now proven to you guys watching this that there actually is a greatest conceivable island just because I've invented the idea for the purposes of making up an example? Gaunilo's claim is clearly there is no such thing as the Lost Island, even though if we were really to follow Anselm's logic, we would have to assert that there is, because the definition alone is supposed to be sufficient to establish that it's real. So the way Gaunilo pushes back on Anselm's argument is to say that if it really worked, then we could establish the existence of all kinds of things that we know are not real by just attaching the phrase greatest conceivable in front of them. So the greatest conceivable hamburger, the greatest conceivable piece of music, the greatest conceivable film. These are not necessarily real things. Anselm's argument attempts to say that in order to be the greatest conceivable X, whatever that thing may be, the thing would have to exist. But obviously we know that there's no such thing as the Lost Island. And so that shows a disproof of the concept that merely having an idea of a greatest conceivable being really establishes that it's real. It doesn't really establish that it exists. because if that was enough to prove the existence of God, then it would also be enough to prove the existence of this clearly made up example of an island that we call him the greatest conceivable island. Okay, now he also has a criticism of the argument from design. And his argument from the design attacks the analogy that was proposed between the watch and the eye. So you remember, right, that with the argument from design by Paley, he says, anything that's functional and complex has to have an intelligent creator. That's why we know a watch has an intelligent creator. And if that's true, then the same will have to be true of like things found in nature that also exhibit function and complexity, like, for example, the eye. So if the watch has to have a watchmaker, then the eye must have an eye maker, and that's God. Now, the objection from Nagel is to say that the comparison of the watch and the eye is a bad comparison. It's really not that they're very similar in any significant way. Now, so let me write this out, problems. With the argument from design. Okay, so he says, the watch-eye analogy is a bad analogy. And why does he say that? He says, well, the reason is because although the watch and the eye do both have a function, the watch tells time and the eye has vision. That's the function of each. Even though they both have this, function thing, it's not actually the function of the watch that informs us that it has an intelligent creator. The real reason that we know that the watch has a creator is not so much to do with the fact that it tells time or that it has a time-telling function. It's just a much more boring and basic reason, he says. The real reason that we know that the watch has a maker is simply because who makes watches? We do. Humans make watches. So as the creators of the watch, we're definitely in a position to say that we know it has a creator. But when we switch our example to the eye, the thing that's being compared with the watch, the fact that it has a function can be explained on a completely different basis without having to assume the existence of any intelligent being. And how do you think there's an alternative explanation for the existence of things in nature that have purpose and function that doesn't rely on the idea of a creator who made those things? The alternative explanation for that is evolutionary theory and Darwinian biology, the theories of evolution from Charles Darwin. According to those theories, which are well supported by empirical evidence and research, you don't need to have an intelligent being to generate things in nature that have function or that are adapted to the conditions of their environment. There's a process known in evolutionary theory called natural selection. And in natural selection, you have an initial set of organisms, and some of them will have chance mutations that better equip them for survival in their environment. So over geologic timescales, the organisms that are better suited to survive more successfully reproduce and pass on their genes. And over long stretches of time, this natural selection process selects for qualities that better adapt the life form to survival in its environment. So the ones that have those adaptations survive and pass on their genes, and the ones that don't die off and don't successfully reproduce and pass their genes on. And over a long time period, we'll see things emerge from this process, like the eye, or like ears, or wings, or what have you, natural things. So two reasons that the analogy is weak. Although the eye and the watch both have a function, the fact that the watch has a function drops out as a significant explanation of why we know it has a creator. And then when we continue and consider the case of the eye or any other natural object that has function, we can say that its function is explainable without reference to an intelligent designer, because it could be explained simply on the basis of the evolutionary theories of natural selection and Darwin. So the function of the watch is not needed to explain that it has a creator, and a creator is not needed to explain the function of the eye. So here we go. And then, so I wrote there, the real reason that we know that the watch has a maker is not because it has a function, but simply because we human beings are the ones who make the watches. And then, second point, um, the function of the eye, etc., because it could be something other than the eye. That's his example, but it could be like ears, nose, fins, wings, whatever specialized form that the natural thing takes so that it can function in an environment. The function of the eye, etc., can also be explained according to a better supported assumption. Let me put it this way. The function of the eye can also be explained without assuming any intelligent creator. Okay, so two problematic facts, according to Nagel, about the design argument. Number one, although the watch and the eye both have function, and that's one point that is supposed to make them analogous, he's trying to deconstruct the comparison. He's saying that although they do both have a function, we can explain that function in the case of the eye without assuming any intelligent designer. And we can also know that the watch has a creator without any reference to its function, simply on the basis that we make those watches ourselves. So the real reason we know the watch has a creator is not because of its function, but rather because we make those watches. And the function of the eye that's being compared with the watch to see its function, that can be explained without having any assumptions of intelligent creation, but rather by just assuming the truth of the theory of evolution and natural selection. So two things having function, but the man-made object, it's known to have a creator simply because it is man-made, regardless of its function. And the things in nature with a function, like, say, for example, the eye, can be explained entirely without assuming at all an act of an intelligent being, like God, because we can simply ascribe it to nature and the process of evolution and natural selection. We would know that anything that was created by human beings was created by human beings, even if it had no function at all. Take like a modern art piece that's just sitting in a contemporary art gallery, like just a big blank canvas with a couple streaks of red on it. That doesn't have any particular function. There's nothing that it can do, but of course, that also has to have an intelligent creator because it's made by us, because we're the ones that make artworks. So he's just saying that the analogy that the watch stands to the watchmaker as the eye stands to God is a flawed analogy, because it's propped up on the idea that anything with a function has an intelligent creator. But the function of the watch isn't even necessary to know that it has a creator that's intelligent. And the function of the eye, it's not even necessary to assume an intelligent being to establish that it has such a function. So these are the points that he raises to show problems with that. Now, in the selection that I gave to you guys, you didn't see any specific objections to Pascal's wager. That is another argument that tries to show that one should believe in God, but Nagel doesn't really touch on it in his own selection that I gave to you. So I'm just going to speak to you briefly about a couple of objections that are out there that do attempt to show the problems with that argument too. Notice that the argument says that it's just better for you to believe in God, because do you really want to be wrong if you choose not to believe? You'd rather be wrong by choosing to believe and nothing really happens than to choose not to believe and be wrong and maybe be punished with hell or denial of heaven. So it's supposed to say that there's more reward, less risk in choosing to believe, more risk, less possible reward in choosing not to believe. But that whole idea assumes that we know what God wants us to do in order to receive his rewards. Is it possible that there are gods that don't, that the actual idea of God is different from the one being assumed by Pascal? Like, what if God, for example, didn't care whether we believed in him or not? Then in that case, there would no longer be these stakes that he is imagining to exist. supposing that God had no interest one way or the other, whether you believed in him, then it might be that believers don't necessarily get the rewards of heaven, even if they believed. And it might also mean that non believers don't receive punishments or denial of rewards on the mere basis that they did not believe. It could be that God, if he exists, dispenses rewards and punishments in the afterlife on a different basis. Or maybe it's a God um, that has different preferences than the ones that are assumed by Pascal. So that's a problem with the Pascal wager. So one problem is okay, so the wager makes the assumption that God cares whether we believe in him. That's the whole basis for the wager, to say that by believing, you're in line for rewards in case there's really God. And if you don't believe, then you're in line for punishment or the wrath of God in case he's real. But suppose that God, if he exists, has no concern as to your belief system or your belief status. If it's not um, of interest to God whether or not you believe in him, then there would be no basis any longer to assume or to assert that believing would meet with God's reward, or the disbelieving would meet with God's punishment. After all, right? Could there be some people who say they believe in God, and maybe they even do, but they do terrible things and they do immoral acts, kill people, whatever? On the other hand, could there be people who make no claim that God exists, but yet they have stellar and upstanding moral lives and moral records, doing a lot of good in the world and helping people? Both things are possible. So to assume that God dispenses rewards and punishments only on that single basis of whether someone has a self-declared belief in God, that might be a false assumption of the argument. And another problem with Pascal's wager that we can add just below is this. Um, some think that it's wrong to believe without sufficient evidence. So okay, there's this other author named W.K. Clifford, and many other people have made a similar type of argument that it's wrong for you to believe things without good enough evidence. You should only follow evidence where it leads, but you shouldn't believe things just based on hope or based on wishful thinking. You should wait for good and solid evidence to show that it's justified. So some people think that Pascal's wager is wrong because it tells you, hey, there's no way to prove God exists or that he doesn't. So just go ahead and choose to believe, because then you're better set up just in case he's real. You're not risking as much and you're better positioned to maybe benefit in case you chose to believe as opposed to not believing. But some people say this is the wrong reason to choose what your beliefs should be. You should only believe things because there's sufficient evidence. That means good enough reasons to back up what you believe. But if you're believing just because you hope this is true, that's generally a wrong thing to do. Some people say that that will make you a poor judge of truth and falsehood, that it will make you credulous or gullible. Believing whatever you hope is true as opposed to what the evidence indicates can get you into a lot of trouble. So some people say that Pascal's wager is just an invitation to operate on wishful thinking and hope instead of just following evidence to its logical conclusion. And so that's another basic point of critique that some people make. And one more issue about Pascal's wager could be this. So let me just add it as a third wheel here. Um, it may not be possible, some think, to choose what to believe. Okay, so some people say the argument is telling you just make a decision to believe in God just on sort of pure policy, like you want to make sure that you're protected against risks. So almost like an insurance policy, just choose to believe in God to secure yourself against the possibilities of being wrong on that. But some might say it's not so easy to just believe based on choice. Like I'm going to tell you right now, I want you to believe that there's a bird here in my hand. There's no way you can make yourself believe that. You could pretend, you could mouth the words, but I know there's no way that you're going to get yourself to actually believe there's a bird right here because you can just see that there's no such thing. So some people say that Pascal's telling you to do something impossible, which is to make a choice to believe something in the absence of sufficient evidence. And to many people, it might seem like it's just impossible to do that. You can only really believe something where the evidence leads you to the belief, that beliefs are not up to you, that there's something that happens automatically. So sometimes the argument is criticized by saying that we have an ability to voluntarily choose what we believe, and that might not actually be true. So a couple of different reasons to find fault with the Pascal wager. Now, the last thing I'm going to close with here, we've definitely not looked at anything like this all semester, so we're ending on this note. At the end of Nagel's writing, he talks about another argument, and this is an argument that is given by atheists to try and show that there is no God. And we haven't looked at that. We've looked at arguments to try to prove there's God, and we've looked at now some criticisms of those arguments, but we have not seen anybody try to turn the tables on the theist and make a direct argument that there is not, in fact, that God does not, in fact, exist. So there are many arguments like that, and one of the most well-known and famous, it's mentioned by him at the end of the essay, so it's called The Problem of Evil. Okay, so the problem of evil is a long-standing argument which attempts to show that there's no God. And it's kind of like been a thorn in the side of theism for generations. In fact, in the early history of the Christian church, there was a whole genre of writing dedicated to trying to overcome the problem of evil or to show why maybe it's not a disproof of God's existence. But anyway, here's how the argument goes. So there are three premises of the argument. Sorry, I meant to say two premises of the argument and one conclusion. So I'm just going to number the premises as 1 and 2, and then I'll type the conclusion below it. The first premise says that if God exists, if God existed, then there would be no evil in the world. The second premise then just continues by saying, but there is evil in the world. So if you put those two premises together, the conclusion that you're left with is that God does not exist. God existed, there'd be no evil in the world, but yet there is, and so there must not be God. That's the argument. Now let's just go through it one time really quick and figure out how the argument works. The first premise says that if God was real, then there wouldn't be any evil. Why do you think one would say that? Well, it has to do with these qualities of God that we've talked about in previous discussions. Some people say of God that God is all-powerful, omnipotent. They also say of God that he is all good, omnibenevolent. But take those 2 points and combine them. If God is all-powerful, that means he can do anything, literally anything. So whatever he wants to have happen, it would happen just because it's his will, and his will is all-powerful. The second point, though, shows that God's all good, so that means that he would be opposed to evil and all things bad and wrong. So God would not want there to be evil because he's omnibenevolent, and he could do something about it at any given time because he's got infinite power. So you would think that a being who's all-powerful and all good would both want to stop and prevent evil, and also would have the means at his disposal to do it at any given time. So you'd think that that would be a recipe for there not being any evil, because God would be able to stop it or prevent it at every occasion with his infinite power and with his infinite goodness. On the other hand, though, we look at the world, now we're getting to premise 2, and we do see that there's a lot of evil stuff happening in it. I mean, I don't think I have to tell you to just look into the news and study facts and understand that sometimes innocent people are getting gunned down and people are getting raped, tortured, killed. There's genocide that has happened in the past. People are convicted of crimes that they didn't commit in some cases and executed, and all the worst things you can imagine sometimes happen, even to very fine and innocent people, children, and the rest. So looking at that fact, that there's so many bad things in the world, some people say, how could there be this much bad stuff unless there's no God? Because if there was a God, he wouldn't allow any of those things to happen. So since they happen anyway, that must mean that we're living in a universe where there's no God. Now that's the problem of evil, but as we've studied objections to the theist arguments, I just want to quickly make a couple points as to what some might say in reaction to this. So a theist who hears this argument must find fault with it. They might say this, that, well, the only reason that we think there's evil is because We can't see everything from God's perspective. Maybe if you back out and you could see it from God's eye view, you would see that what seems evil to us is actually, in the biggest picture, all for the best. Maybe God wants to allow us to overcome adversities and obstacles so that we can recognize the value of goodness and righteousness by exposing us to some quantity of evil so that we more powerfully make choices to avoid it ourselves. Maybe it's He's given us free will and all the evil is due to us instead of other things. But on all these points, there's at least some possible reason to disagree. You could say that, well, if you're saying that evil is just evil from our perspective, but from the big point of view of God, it's all for the best, we could still ask, well, why does even apparent evil exist? Even the appearance of evil is less than perfectly ideal. If God's all powerful and all good, you'd think that he could have eliminated even these passing and temporary states that we think of as so bad, because the world would be better if that didn't exist. You can also say that it's really no consolation to a person who's suffering in this world by telling them, don't worry, it's all for the best. You just can't see God's plan or the mysterious ways that he's working in. They're still suffering. They're still going through tough times. And so even apparent evil is still something less than ideal. Look back to the old Genesis accounts from the Abrahamic religions of the Garden of Eden. It seems there that even in the scriptures, it was desired and intended by God for man to live in a kind of paradise. And only through the fall of Eve eating from the fruit of the tree of wisdom does man fall and then have to atone for his sins and etc. But here again, I mean, who gives the serpent presence in the Garden of Eden and who allows them to even tempt Eve? Furthermore, if God is omniscient, then he already knew in advance how the whole scenario would play out. So there's still problems and difficulties with trying to reason out that it's the fall of man caused by Eve being tempted by the serpent that produced these states of so-called evil that we think we're seeing. The author Nagel, he says something I thought that was kind of clever. He says, isn't it just pure speculation, too, to say that what you think is evil is really all for the best? We could easily flip that around and say that whatever you think is good, when you see people being nice to each other and acting in a way that's generous, kind, humble, that's actually just a tease, and it's all for the worst, because the universe is ruled over by the most evil conceivable being. You don't want to believe that, of course, because it's dark and scary, but on the other hand, it's just as well supported as the alternative assumption that's being given to try and prove theism. So he says it seems like it's just kind of unsupported speculation. Yeah. And let's see if I have anything more to say on criticism of the problem of evil and what responses there could be. Yeah, so I mean, the existence of God, that's the question. Some people think that there can't be a God in a world that has so much evil in it. And in reply to that, some people say that, the evil you're seeing is just an illusion or it's all for the best in the big picture. Other people say that God grants us free will, and it's free will that we have, which causes us the ability to see and do evil things, which is traced back in the Christian and other Abrahamic traditions to the original fall of man by the actions taken in the Garden of Eden by Eve. But again, you can penetrate into that a little more deeply and ask, why were the conditions made possible by God for such a fall to even happen in the first place? And one last point. If you try and associate the existence of evil with the ability of human beings to do things that are bad, that still doesn't account for all the evil things that happen from just nature. When earthquakes kill thousands of people, or when tsunami waves or torrential rains wipe out whole cities, we can't say that that's somebody who made a free decision and that it's just their actions that are not attributable to God. So I don't know. In the end, the problem of evil has raised some doubts about the existence of God. I mean, I'm sure that if I had lost a loved one in a terrible tragedy, like something completely preventable or something that was just really wrong, it might be hard for you to return back to your comfortable and confident belief in God. You might be shaken and think maybe it's all just a myth, and we're living in a world that's not presided over by a perfectly good and powerful being, because it just doesn't seem to be congruent with the evident facts of all the harm and loss and disappointment that sometimes people suffer through. But anyway, I've tried to give you guys now some balance on both ends of it, and that really concludes this meeting and this topic of objections to the various arguments or criticisms of the various arguments for God's existence. So wherever you stand, guys, whatever religious tradition, whatever theological position you may have or not have, I just hope that you've been able to take away some important insights, both historically and philosophically, from studying the world religions and these arguments. So I'm really proud of you if you've made it this far and you're watching this lesson. I appreciate all your hard work this semester, and I'm wishing you all the best as we head into finals next week. So for now, I'm signing off, and I'll be in touch if you need anything from me. But have a really good day, and take it easy. This is me closing our lecture series. Okay, thank you guys. Bye.